In 1900, a coal broker named Joseph Stickney, born in Concord, New Hampshire, made rich by anthracite mines 800 miles away, began building a hotel at the base of Mount Washington that would cost him $1.7 million, more than almost any private citizen in America could have raised for a single building. On the day it opened, July 28, 1902, Stickney stood in front of reporters and told them to look at him. He was, in his own words, the fool who had built all of it. He was dead within a year. His hotel outlived him by more than a century, and it outlived nearly everything built beside it. The resorts that rose in the same decades, financed by men with the same confidence. Only a handful of buildings from that era still stand in these mountains, and only 4 still operate as hotels. Stickney's is one of them. What happened to the other 96 is the rest of this story. Chapter 1. The Only Way Through. 2 gaps cut the White Mountains open, and for 200 years almost nothing moved through this country that did not move through one of them. Crawford Notch runs south of the Presidential Range, a corridor scraped down to bare rock by glaciers that finished their work roughly 12,000 years before anyone thought to build a hotel here. Franconia Notch does the same work 12 miles to the west, splitting the Franconia Range into 2 walls of granite with a single road width of level ground between them, stagecoach lines, railroad spurs, grand hotels that would rise and vanish in these mountains over the following century. All of it had to thread one of these 2 needles to exist at all. There was no other way in. Above both notches stands Mount Washington, 6,288 feet, the tallest peak in the northeastern United States and the reason the range carries the name of the first 6 presidents. On April 12, 1934, an observer stationed at the summit recorded a wind gust of 231 miles per hour, the strongest wind ever measured by a human being on the surface of the earth, a record that would stand, unbroken by any land station, for 62 years. The mountain did not care who came to look at it. It killed people who underestimated it, and made fortunes for people who understood how to profit from the ones who came to try. Today, the White Mountain National Forest covers more than 800,000 acres of New Hampshire and western Maine. Land now held in trust, hiked for free, photographed by people who assume it was always this way. Nearly all of it once belonged to private companies, hotel corporations, logging syndicates, men who bought the mountains the way other men bought railroads. How the public came to own what private fortunes once controlled is a later part of this story. Before any of that, there were the Crawfords. In 1790, Abel Crawford and his wife Hannah walked into the notch that would later carry their name and settled there, among the first permanent residents the White Mountains had ever had. The winters were long, the soil was thin, and the nearest neighbors were days away. They stayed anyway. Their son, Ethan Allen Crawford, grew into the mountains the way his parents had grown into the clearing. As a hunter first, then a guide, then something closer to an institution. Travelers heading north through the notch had almost nowhere to sleep and almost no one to trust with the climb, so the Crawfords became both, innkeepers and pathfinders, running a scatter of small lodgings that included Abel's own Mount Crawford house, taking in the trickle of visitors who came to see the mountain up close. It was not a business yet. It was survival that happened to have paying customers attached to it. In 1819, Abel and Ethan Allen Crawford cut a footpath from the notch to the summit of Mount Washington, not for sport, but because a marked trail made guiding easier and safer for the people they were leading. They called it, eventually, the Crawford Path. It is still there. Hikers climb it today exactly as they did 2 centuries ago, making it the oldest continuously maintained hiking trail in the United States. A footpath cut by 2 men who wanted nothing more than to get their clients up a mountain and back down again without losing anyone. For 30 years, the Crawfords were the mountain's only interpreters, the only people who could tell a stranger what the peaks meant or how to survive them. That arrangement did not last. Word had begun to travel south, to Boston, to New York, to men who had never split a cord of wood or buried a winter's worth of provisions, that there was something in these granite walls worth looking at. The first of them arrived with paintbrushes instead of axes. Chapter 2. The Painters, the Rails, and the First Grand House. The first of them was a 31-year-old Englishman named Thomas Cole, who arrived in 1828 with a portfolio under his arm, and no particular plan beyond finding something worth drawing. He found it at Crawford Notch, where the granite closed in on both sides of the road like the walls of a corridor built for something larger than men. Cole sketched for days. What he carried back to his studio became the foundation of what critics would later call the White Mountain School. Not a school with a building or a headmaster, an actual movement, a shared visual language for turning New Hampshire granite into something a Boston banker could hang above his mantel. Within a generation, painting the White Mountains was not an eccentricity. It was a career. More than 400 artists would eventually work the region, filling canvases with the same peaks from 100 different angles, selling them to city buyers who had never climbed higher than a townhouse staircase. Some of these buyers came to see the originals for themselves. Most did not need to. A painting was cheaper than a journey, and for the first wave of interest, a painting was enough. But interest compounds. By the late 1840s, the paintings had done their work. They had planted an idea of the mountains in the minds of people who could afford to indulge it. What the mountains lacked was a way in. That changed in 1850 when railroad service finally reached the edge of the range, closing the gap between a Boston train platform and a landscape that had until then required a full day's coach ride to reach. The same year, at the head of Crawford Notch, the same notch Cole had sketched 22 years earlier, the first Crawford house opened its doors. It was not large by the standards of what would follow. It did not need to be. It was first, and in a market built on novelty, first was worth more than square footage. 2 years later, a hotelier named Richard Taft moved on Franconia Notch, 30 miles to the west, where a different rock formation was drawing its own share of painters and curiosity seekers. Taft's Flume and Franconia Hotel Company broke ground in 1852 on a house he called the Profile House, and it opened the following year to guests eager to sleep within sight of a granite face nature had arranged by accident into something resembling a man's profile. Taft understood something his competitors were only beginning to grasp. The mountains themselves were the product, but a guest needed somewhere to be while looking at them. The hotel was the delivery mechanism. Then, in 1859, fire took the original Crawford house to the ground. What replaced it was not a restoration. It was an argument made in timber and glass that the first version had been too modest. The new Crawford house grew over the following years until it could hold 400 guests at once, the largest hotel anywhere in the White Mountains. A small city of a building, with an orchestra, bowling alleys, and a staff numbering in the hundreds, standing at the mouth of a notch that 30 years earlier had held nothing but granite, spruce, and the Crawford family's single toll road. The transformation had taken 3 decades. It would not slow down from here. None of the men building these hotels knew what had happened in that notch on a single night in August, decades before any of them arrived. Before the first railroad tie was laid, years ahead of Cole unpacking his sketchbook, long before there was a road wide enough for a coach, a family had been sleeping in a small house at the base of the slope. Something on the mountainside above them had let go in the dark. What it left behind, and what it did not, is a story the hotel guests would come to hear told and retold on the wide porches Richard Taft and the Crawfords built, usually after dinner, usually by lamplight, usually without anyone quite agreeing on the details. Chapter 3. The Road, the Roof, and the Night the Mountain Moved. In 1853, a stone structure rose on the summit of Mount Washington. Its walls ran 2 feet thick, cut and mortared from the same granite the building stood on. low, and squared against wind, that would later be clocked on that summit at speeds no other structure in the country was built to survive. The tip-top house held 18 rooms above the tree line, in a landscape where nothing grows taller than scrub above 4,000 feet. It housed the season's hardiest guests, travelers willing to ride or walk the final miles to sleep on bare rock in a building that resembled a fortification more than a hotel. Of every structure raised on that summit during the boom years that followed, it is the only one still standing today. 8 years after the tip-top house was finished, in 1861, workers completed a carriage road to the same summit, a project that had taken 8 years of blasting and grading to cut a path wide enough for horse teams hauling loaded coaches around grades no other road in New England matched. It was built for hooves and wooden wheels. The automobile would not climb it for another 4 decades. The men who financed it were not betting on a railroad or a rival resort. They were betting that Americans would pay to be carried slowly toward a view, and they were right. That road remains open today, America's oldest continuously operating man-made tourist attraction. None of this, the stone hotel, the carriage road, the porches where guides would tell the Notch's oldest story after dinner, existed yet on the night of August 28, 1826, 35 miles south in Crawford Notch. To find that story requires moving back 3 decades, past the founding of every hotel described so far, to a smaller structure at the base of a mountain that had nothing to do with tourism at all. Rain had fallen over the Notch for days by the evening of August 28, 1826, heavy enough that the ground on the slope above one small house had begun to give. The house belonged to the Willey family. 9 people slept under its roof that night. 2 parents, 5 children, and 2 hired hands. Sometime after the household had gone to bed, the slope above them let go. The slide came down as a mass of rock, mud, and uprooted trees, loud enough and close enough that the household had time to do one thing. They ran. 9 people left the house in the dark and went out directly into the slide's path. In daylight, the higher ground nearby would have been an easy walk. In rain at night, with the mountain already moving, it was not. Behind the house, the slide struck a ledge, split into 2 channels, and rejoined below, leaving the structure itself untouched, without a cracked window or a shifted timber. Everyone who had stayed inside would have lived. Search parties worked the slope for weeks afterward, recovering what the slide had left of the 2 parents, 2 of the daughters, and both hired hands. 6 bodies, scattered across the debris below the house. The 3 youngest children were never found that week, or in any of the searches that followed in the years after. Newspapers from Maine to South Carolina carried the account within days, giving Crawford Notch a name that no railroad prospectus or hotel advertisement would manage to erase from it. Within 2 years, artists and travelers were making the detour specifically to see the house. Empty, unmarked, structurally intact, standing alone on a slope still stripped bare on either side of it. The 3 children were never recovered. Chapter 4. The 100 Hotels. By 1885, the White Mountains had become something no stretch of American wilderness had been before or would be again. A landscape organized almost entirely around hospitality. More than 100 hotels operated across the region at the height of the season, from modest boarding houses in Jackson to palace-sized resorts that employed small armies of staff. No comparable concentration existed anywhere else in the country. New York's buildings were grander, taken one at a time, and Newport's money ran older. But nowhere else had an entire mountain range been turned into a hotel district the way the White Mountains had. The infrastructure that made this possible had been mocked into existence 16 years earlier. In 1869, an inventor named Sylvester Marsh finished a railway that climbed Mount Washington on a track laid directly up its western flank, a project the New Hampshire legislature had once approved, partly because a lawmaker joked he would sooner grant Marsh a railway to the moon. Marsh's folly, the newspapers called it, until it worked. The finish line ran 3¼ miles, with a grade that reached 37.4% at a section workers named Jacob's Ladder, steep enough that passengers gripped their seats without being told to. It cost $150,000 to build and became the first mountain climbing cog railway constructed anywhere in the world. Within a decade, engineers from Europe were arriving to study it. What the railway proved? That the mountains could be reached without being endured. The hotels then spent 3 decades capitalizing on. The profile house, built beneath the shadow of the Old Man of the Mountain, expanded until it slept 600 guests. The Crawford House, already established as the largest resort in the region, held 400. The Glen House sat at the literal base of Mount Washington, positioned so that carriages could leave its front steps and begin the ascent within minutes. Beyond them, a second tier of resorts filled out the range: the Wambeck, the Fabian House, and the Mountain View House, each drawing its own clientele of returning families who treated a single hotel as a fixed point on the calendar, arriving in June and not leaving until September. There were orchestras that played through dinner and into the evening. There were golf courses cut fresh into hayfields that had grown potatoes a generation earlier. There were porches built long enough that a full circuit of one at a walking pace took nearly 4 minutes. Picture standing on the Crawford House's front lawn on the afternoon of August 14, 1891, the cog railway's small steam engine visible in the distance, a thin column of exhaust rising against the ridge of Mount Washington. Croquet mallets click against wooden balls somewhere past the flower beds. A string quartet tunes inside, faintly audible through open windows ahead of the 6 o'clock dinner seating. Guests move along a porch measuring nearly 900 feet, dressed for an evening that has not yet begun, having already committed to 11 more weeks in this one building. Stagecoaches and increasingly Spain-C Saint-Jean-Anqui private rail cars arrive on a schedule as fixed as the tide. Nothing about the scene suggests an industry with an expiration date. 4 of these hotels will still be standing a century later. The rest will not. The families who built and ran these houses had, by the 1890s, turned hospitality into something close to a regional government, setting prices, controlling land, dictating which villages prospered and which stayed forgotten farm country. It was, for a moment, enough. But money at this scale attracts more money, and somewhere south of the mountains, a man with a fortune built on something other than hotels was beginning to ask why no one had yet built the largest one of all. Chapter 5. The Italians Who Built the Crown. By 1900, Joseph Stickney had decided that the White Mountains lacked only one thing: a hotel large enough to end the argument entirely. He chose a site on the shoulder of Mount Washington itself, 7,000 feet below the summit, facing west into a valley of nothing but spruce and granite. Construction crews arrived that spring with a schedule that allowed for no delay and no excuse. Stickney wanted the hotel open within 2 seasons, a timeline that any builder in Boston or New York would have called reckless for a structure of its size. He got his wish anyway. The design belonged to Charles Alling Gifford, a New York architect who gave the building its Spanish Renaissance towers and its half-mile veranda, wide enough for guests to walk the length of a city block without leaving the porch. For the fieldstone foundation and the exterior stonework, Stickney's crews brought in 250 Italian stonemasons, most of them recruited directly off ships in Boston Harbor and housed in a temporary camp near the construction site through 2 mountain winters. They cut and set granite by hand, block by block, working through cold that killed lesser projects outright. The hotel opened on July 28, 1902, its red roof and white walls visible from towns 11 miles down the valley. Among the 100-odd resort hotels then operating across the White Mountains, it was, by universal agreement, the largest and the last of its kind. Stickney did not live to see a second season under that roof. His death settled the matter of who had built the mountain's final monument, and the industry moved on without him, the way it always had. What the hotel's grandeur obscured, from its verandas and its dining rooms, was the condition of the land supporting it. The same decades that built the great houses had also opened the forests around them to a scale of logging the region had never seen. Timber companies moved through the hillsides surrounding the resort towns with a thoroughness that left almost nothing standing. Entire slopes were stripped bare for lumber, and what timber had no commercial value was cleared anyway, to make room for pasture, or simply because clearing was cheaper than selective cutting. The work proceeded in full view of the hotel's upper floors, though few guests ever asked what it meant. Fewer still had reason to. Logging of this kind produced a byproduct the industry had no plan for: slash. Branches, bark, treetops, and sawdust were left behind in drifts across the cleared hillsides, sometimes 10 feet deep, drying through summer into something closer to kindling than forest debris. The railroads that had made the hotels possible ran their locomotives directly through and beside these slash fields, hauling both timber and tourists on the same lines. Cinders thrown from coal-fired engines needed only a dry August to find fuel. When they did, the fires that followed did not behave like ordinary forest fires. They fed on slash piles that had been accumulating for years, and they burned for weeks at a stretch, sometimes for months, consuming ground that logging had already stripped of anything to slow them down. None of this had yet touched the hotels directly. The grand houses kept filling their rooms each summer, running their orchestras into the evening, measuring success in guests received rather than acres lost. But the same railroads that carried the wealthy up from Boston carried the sparks that were by degrees, turning the hills around them into something closer to a woodpile. Smoke sat on the ridge lines above the dining rooms that summer, thin, distant, easy to mistake for weather. Chapter 6. What the Water Could Not Reach. The smoke that closed the previous summer did not stay confined to the ridgelines for long. By 1911, the hillsides logging companies had stripped bare across the White Mountains were no longer just unsightly. They were eroding, flooding the valleys below in spring and drying to tinder in August, and the pattern had repeated often enough that Washington could no longer treat it as a regional nuisance. That year, Congress passed the Weeks Act. It authorized the federal government to buy the ruined land outright, not from sentiment, but because the alternative was watching it wash into the rivers a second time. The purchase price was $13 an acre, land that timber barons had clear-cut for a fraction of what it once produced in board feet went back to the government at a price close to what scrub and stump fields were worth. It was not a rescue so much as a settlement. Over the following decades, tract by tract, that $13 an acre wasteland became the seed of an 800,000-acre national forest, the same forest whose peaks and passes had been drawing tourists north since before the first hotel opened its doors. The land the hotels had been built to look out over was, at last, going to be protected from the industry that had built the hotels. None of this saved the buildings. The grand houses kept operating through the 1910s, much as they always had, their orchestras still tuning up each evening, their dining rooms still filling with the same families who had summered there for 2 and 3 generations. The Profile House, established in the previous decade as one of the largest resorts in the range, carried on as it always had. 600 guests at capacity, a small city of verandas and outbuildings arranged around the base of the cliff that had made the property famous. It had survived fires before, in the way most of these hotels had survived fires before, on luck and quick buckets and a wind that happened to shift. On August 2, 1923, its luck ran out. The fire broke out at the height of the season, with every room filled and the dining hall set for the evening meal. It moved through wood frame construction that had been standing wing after added wing for 60 years, catching each new section faster than the last. The hotel's own hoses could raise water only so high, and the upper floors, the ones farthest from the ground-level mains, went up first and burned the longest. Guests and staff were evacuated onto the tennis courts, a flat, cleared space with nothing left to burn, and from there they watched the resort come down. There was nothing else useful to do. The water pressure required to reach the top stories of a building that size did not exist in that valley in 1923, and no amount of urgency could manufacture it. In 4 hours, the fire took 26 buildings. It took the main hotel, the cottages, the stables, the laundry, the recreation hall, and the network of covered walkways that had let guests move between them without stepping outside in the rain. It took the ballroom where 3 generations of the same families had danced. By the time the flames burned down to what they could no longer reach, there was a single structure left standing on the entire property. The train depot, set apart from the rest by distance and by luck, the last thing arriving passengers would see, and now the only thing left to see at all. Chapter 7. The Arithmetic of Decline. The fire that took the hotel in the previous chapter was not an isolated catastrophe. It was one entry in a ledger that the White Mountains kept for the better part of a century, and by the time anyone thought to add up the column, the total was almost incomprehensible. The first blow was not flame at all. It was a machine. The automobile did not attack the grand hotels directly. It attacked the assumption they were built on. For 60 years, a family of means arrived at a hotel in June and left in September, occupying the same rooms, sitting at the same dining tables, forming friendships that resumed each summer like a serial novel. The automobile made that arrangement optional, then old-fashioned, then extinct. A traveler with a car did not need to commit a season to one hillside. He could see the presidential range on Monday and be in the Berkshires by Friday. The math that had supported 400 employees, a resident orchestra, and a working farm for a single property no longer worked when guests stayed 4 nights instead of 4 months. Occupancy fell. Payrolls did not shrink to match it. The hotels built for a world of stationary leisure were left standing in a world that had learned to keep moving. Fire did the rest, and it did it with a consistency that stopped looking like accident and started looking like inheritance. At the base of Mount Washington, on the same plot of ground, 4 successive versions of the Glen House were built between 1851 and 1967. The first Glen House burned. The second Glen House burned. The third Glen House burned. The fourth went up in 1967, and by then the pattern was no longer a coincidence anyone bothered to remark on. In 1928, the Waumbek Hotel burned, ending a run of summers that had once counted a sitting president among its guests. The second Crawford House, built to replace the one destroyed decades earlier, spent its final years half-staffed and unheated in winter, closed for good in 1975, and stood empty for 2 more years before fire took it as well, in November of 1977. Nothing rebuilt it. Nothing rebuilt any of them. By the 1960s, the count told its own story, without needing embellishment. Of the more than 100 grand hotels that had defined this region's golden decades, most were simply gone. A portion had been demolished for the value of their land. Vandals stripped others bare over years of vacancy before the final collapse. The rest were finished off by exactly the kind of fire that had taken the Glen House 3 times over. The workforce that had once numbered in the thousands each summer dispersed into other industries. The train lines that had been built to feed these hotels lost their reason for existing and were pulled up rail by rail. Of the original hotel empire that once dominated this stretch of New Hampshire, only 8 buildings still stand today. Only 4 of those still operate as hotels. Not every structure obeyed the pattern. One hotel from the same era, built by the same appetite for scale, and built to the same excess, did not burn. It never closed in disrepair or sat waiting decades for a fire to finish what neglect had started. It is standing at this moment, largely as it stood when it opened, having outlasted the automobile, survived 2 world wars, and stood past every rival that once shared its guest registers and its ambitions. And in the years just ahead of where this account has taken you, that hotel would be asked to host something entirely outside the business of hospitality, an event whose consequences would reach far past the White Mountains, far past New Hampshire, and far past anything a resort hotel had ever been built to hold. Chapter 8: The Hotel That Did Not Burn. The hotel is the Mount Washington Hotel, and in July of 1944, it did something no resort in the White Mountains had ever been built to do. For the length of its stay, 730 delegates from 44 allied nations filled its dining room and its corridors, working behind guarded doors under a secrecy its original guests would never have recognized. They were not there for the mountain air. They were drafting the financial architecture of the post-war world, and by the time they left, the meetings held inside that white wooden hotel had produced the founding charters of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. A building raised to sell scenery to the wealthy had become, for a few weeks, the address of the global economy. Then the delegates went home, and the hotel went back to being a hotel. It is still one. The Omni Mount Washington Hotel operates today as a National Historic Landmark, its red roof and long white porches visible from the same valley floor where Joseph Stickney's guests once arrived by private rail car. The cog railway that first hauled tourists to the summit in the 1860s still runs, its engines pushing the same grade at the same angle they always did. The Mount Washington Auto Road, opened the same decade, still carries cars up switchbacks to a summit that has never once become easier to reach. Of the great hotels this account has followed, one reached the 21st century standing at its original scale. This is the one. Not everything the mountains built outlasted the era that built it. On May 2, 2003, the granite ledges on Cannon Mountain, known as the Old Man of the Mountain, a profile that had watched over the notches for millennia and become the unofficial symbol of the state, gave way overnight. It had been stamped on license plates, road signs, the state quarter. It had outlasted the hotel era by decades. By morning, the cliff face was blank rock, and the collapse had come the way the hotels went, all at once, with no one watching and no warning given to anyone below. Hikers moving through the forest today still find what the hotels left behind. Stone foundations sit half-buried under fern and duff, their outlines square where nothing square grows naturally. Brick chimneys stand alone with no walls attached to them, rising out of second-growth timber where dining rooms and ballrooms once stood. Rusted machinery and lengths of iron pipe surface at the edges of hiking trails, unlabeled to the people who step over them. The White Mountain National Forest now covers more than 800,000 acres of this ground, land that a century ago was clear-cut for lumber, owned outright by hotel corporations or on fire. The economy the mountains support now is smaller and asks less of them. Hikers pay trailhead fees measured in dollars, not fortunes. Leaf peepers fill motel rooms for a few weeks each October and drive home. Ski resorts run lifts over slopes that once bordered hunting preserves attached to hotels with dining rooms built for hundreds. None of it requires a French chef retained year-round, a private telegraph line, or a guest list drawn from railroad boardrooms. The mountains draw visitors now on roughly the terms they drew them before the first hotel ever went up, briefly, seasonally, without any claim on permanence. At the base of Mount Washington, the hotel is lit tonight the way it has been lit for more than 100 years. One long line of window light laid against a black tree line that gives none of it back. Snow moves off the summit in a thin plume visible from the valley. Pushed sideways by wind, the mountain has never stopped producing. Everything around the hotel that was built to the same scale, in the same decade, by men who shared its ambitions, is gone, collapsed, or reduced to a foundation in the leaf litter. The hotel is still there because nothing ever forced it to be otherwise. The mountain has not moved at all.